Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I apologize. I'm recuperating from a cold, and so I'm going to be wearing a mask. So I hope I don't sound too muffled. So stop me if I'm not clear. Thank you so much. So I'm going to get started by letting you know that the presentation that I'm giving today is part of a book project. And that book is based in part on an essay that I wrote that will be appearing in this book that is coming out in a couple weeks. And this is one of the photos in that book, in that essay. So let's get started. And the region that I'm going to be talking about today is Western Nicaragua. And I have several maps that I want to share with you. One of them, as you can see, is a mid-19th century map. And over here we have a much more contemporary map of Nicaragua. And the way in which it would work is if you drew a line through the center, everything left of center would be Western Nicaragua. I have yet another map, and this one you can see how Western Nicaragua, where it lies in relation to the rest of Central America and Mexico. I want to focus on 4 significant events from the mid-19th century that deeply impacted Western Nicaragua. So we have independence in 1821, then we have the end of the enslavement of people of African ancestry in 1824, then we have something that happened in California but had a huge impact in Western Nicaragua, and that is the California Gold Rush of 1848. And then finally, we have the arrival in Nicaragua of the mercenary and filibuster William Walker, and he arrived in 1855. Getting to California's gold from the east coast of the United States, whether it was New York or New Orleans, to San Francisco often took place through Nicaragua. And some of you might be familiar with these types of ads. You can see this is an ad for a steamship during the gold rush. This is the route that many, many hundreds of thousands of people took from the East Coast to San Francisco via Nicaragua. As you can see, it was much shorter than the Panama route, so it was actually very attractive. Here you have some close-ups of what that looked like. And one of the things that's going to disrupt that route is William Walker's takeover of Nicaragua in 1855. So originally he arrived, he was invited by one of the two sides of a prolonged civil war that was taking place, but very soon he decided to instead take over the country and declare himself president. This is the book, the cover of the book that he wrote about that war, which he himself titled The War in Nicaragua and wrote in the third person. And over here we have, this is the press from the mid-19th century talking about that transit route, which was in fact disrupted by the war in Nicaragua. And then what we have is one of the major events that took place under Walker during his rule in Nicaragua during this period, which was, and you can see here again in the press of the time, the reinstitution of enslavement in Nicaragua in 1856. So everything I've shared with you is basically a standard narrative about the history of Western Nicaragua, and we're going to add to that these other points that actually I am about to contest in the rest of my presentation. So I'm just going to go over them really quickly. Part of the standard narrative is that there was no slavery in California, that the reinstitution of slavery in Nicaragua in 1856 did not matter because it was so short-lived, because in fact, sorry, and I apologize, it's my cold. Because in fact, William Walker eventually was executed in Honduras in 1860 after all Central American countries united to defeat him. And finally, there's this idea that white US enslavers did not take enslaved African Americans with them to Nicaragua. So in my project, my findings, what I have found is that in fact, peoples were trafficked from the United States through Nicaragua to California. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you the names of these individuals since I find it important that we remember them. So we have Harriet, Landon, Nancy, Daniel, Richard, Washington Canton, Maria, and Francis Muncie, who was trafficked alongside James and William, her two sons. So as you can see, they were trafficked before slavery was reinstituted in Nicaragua, at a time when technically slavery was illegal in both Nicaragua and California. Here we have another individual, and in this case, Jane Johnson, this case is actually very, very famous, so many of you might already know about it, but she and her two sons were about to be trafficked to Nicaragua by their enslaver, John Wheeler, who had been named U.S. representative to Walker's government in Nicaragua. But Jane Johnson, of course enslaved, decided that she wanted freedom instead. She did not want to go to Nicaragua, enslaved with this man. And so when they stopped in Philadelphia, then she was able to successfully gain her freedom with the assistance of abolitionists. And it's a super famous case. It set precedent, etc. Here we have an engraving of her, of Jane. And here we have a depiction of that famous moment that was very covered at the time in the news, and still today, again, is written about often. Oops. So, in addition to individuals being trafficked from the United States through Nicaragua to California, right, we also found the case of two individuals who were trafficked successfully, unfortunately, directly to Nicaragua. One case was that of Miriam, a 15-year-old, and in that case, it was after slavery had ended. Slavery had become legal again in Nicaragua. And the other case was that of Chesterfield, who I'm going to speak about. And Chesterfield was 13 years old. So Chesterfield's enslavers arrived in Nicaragua from the United States, and they were part of a larger group of individuals, most of them white folks, who had arrived in order to claim lands in Nicaragua that were going to be taken away from Nicaraguans who opposed Walker. As you can see, the family, most of them died, and then eventually Chesterfield was able to gain his freedom, much to the chagrin of his owners, one of them, who later would write, "I lost the last possession I had in the world, but was willing to see him suffer for his ingratitude." Not surprisingly, once Eleanor died in Nashville in 1898, the heading of her obituary was "Good Woman Gone." So, to wrap it up, what is the significance then of this project? As you can imagine, I have a lot of different points, and so I am going to go through some of them fairly quickly. So I contend that formerly enslaved individuals from other regions of Latin America actually found Nicaragua to be a great place to restart their lives after they were freed, and even before, because Nicaragua, Western Nicaragua, had a huge population, well, relatively huge, of individuals of African ancestry, and so this was a good place to disappear into. And so we have a case, for example, of Ponciano Corral, who had been enslaved in Costa Rica and moves to Nicaragua, eventually joining the ruling class. And here we have a painting of the execution of Ponciano, actually by William Walker in the mid-1850s. He was executed for treason, and he was someone who was formerly enslaved of African ancestry. Now, Nicaragua had become important in U.S. conversations that had to do with enslavement, as well as conversations regarding Black freedom, even before William Walker rescinded the Constitution that had abolished slavery. The political scientist Juliet Hooker, for instance, notes that in 1852, when slavery was still legal in the U.S., African Americans found in Nicaragua an inspiring example of what they called a colored republic, in which Blacks and people of mixed ancestry were exercising political power, and the case of Ponciano Corral is exactly an example of that. Now, I consider that it makes sense to talk about Chester's journey, albeit as an enslaved child, as part of what Juliet Hooker calls African American quests for Black freedom in Central America. And additionally, I argue that the reinstatement of enslavement could not have had neutral consequences, as some have argued. Unfortunately, minimizing the importance of enslavement in Western Nicaragua during the mid-19th century has led to romanticized versions of William Walker's brutal takeover of Nicaragua to the detriment of us all. Thank you.
This was right on the money. Thank you, thank you.
Question.
Any questions, please?
Should I keep this? Okay. Yes.
I know nothing about history, so forgive me if my question is too naive. And I'm actually interested in your methodology that brought you to this conclusion, especially it's different from the statement narrative. So for example, was it based on historical document, or how did you get a different conclusion from the statement narrative?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So yes, so to be honest, part of the reason why I've been able to do a different type of research has to do, I hate to admit this, with technology. Because so much more material has been digitized and is accessible now. That was not previously. So that's part of it. Some of it, it's just like a perfect storm of what was lacking before compared to some of the things we have access to now. So part of it is simply that, access to the sources. And what kind of sources? Well, I'm talking about slave manifests, census records, newspapers, obituaries, diaries, those basically the standard historical sources, yes. Mm-hmm.
Since your focus is on Western Nicaragua, can you talk about sort of what the distinction was with Eastern Nicaragua? Was it just that this wasn't happening in that part, or were they separated at the time?
Yeah, so the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua has a completely different history in the sense that it was colonized by the British. And so there also was enslavement of African peoples, of course. But in this case, you had different empires at play. And so what ended up happening is that it wasn't until the late 1890s that Western Nicaragua took over the Caribbean coast through force. So this idea of a united Nicaragua is kind of a myth in the sense of it's wishful thinking on the part of the Western Nicaraguans who took it over.
And to just extend it further out, what about other Central American countries?
Oh.
I mean, briefly, you know, how with respect to slavery and...
Oh, that's such a good question. So the question, I don't know if everyone could hear it, it has to do with other Central American countries. So for such a small region, you would think we'd have more similarities, which we do, not to say that we don't, but there are also important differences. And so obviously on the Caribbean, you have the presence and the impact, again, of British colonialism and British imperialism and the British presence overall. And then you also have, obviously, the Spanish on the Pacific, and then you have the United States. You also have the French involved. You have all sorts of different groups involved at different times. But all of that to say, Nicaragua, I'm not going to argue that Nicaragua is special, but Nicaragua has had historically, like I mentioned before, Western Nicaragua has a large, or rather, most of the people who were living in Western Nicaragua during this period were of mixed African ancestry, like the vast majority. That's the case of some of my ancestors, right? And so that was slightly different from other places, for example, like Costa Rica, where it wasn't necessarily as visible. And today, in some places in Central America, like in El Salvador, you even have myths that are wrong, but historical myths that you have people who even argue that you didn't have a presence at all of people of African ancestry in El Salvador, which of course is completely incorrect, but you can see how each country developed its own, particular dynamics. Mm-hmm.
Do you see a Sorry, do you see a connection with what you learned in your research about American involvement in Nicaragua and the narrative they told about their empire and renewed involvement of America in Central and South America, especially Panama and Venezuela? Currently.
Sorry. So I'm a historian. So I'm not an expert on the present. 1 minute. So in 1 minute, and with that caveat, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very hard to find anything good coming out of U.S. involvement historically. Again, I'm not talking about the present. I'm not an expert on the present, but I can tell you historically, you could pay me a lot of money, and I would spend a lot of time trying to find, positive outcomes from imperialistic interventions in Latin America. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.